New York City, 1890. When we speak of the Gilded Age, the mental image is usually of progress, of steel rising, and of millionaires building empires along Fifth Avenue. But the wealth accumulation of that era was matched only by the human compression happening just a few miles south. Forget the myth of the vibrant melting pot. If you move toward the nexus of Old Manhattan, you find an area where the promises of America evaporated upon arrival. We are talking about 5 Points. This was not a neighborhood. It was a geographic wound. Look closely at the historical maps. 5 streets, Mulberry, Cross, Orange, Anthony, and Little Water, converged into a congested, suffocating knot of human misery and architectural failure. This specific geometry created the ideal incubator for chaos. It was a place where, historically, the very police officers sworn to uphold the law would not, under any circumstances, patrol alone. The fear was real, systemic, and rooted deep in the foundations of this ground zero of American crime. The geographic reality of 5 Points was a critical co-conspirator in its own collapse. The sheer density was almost unimaginable, even by today's standards. Following the massive waves of immigration, particularly the Irish escaping the famine and later Italian immigrants, the area became a pressure cooker. Structures designed for single families were subdivided and packed, sometimes housing over 2,000 people per acre. These were not just overcrowded buildings, they were monuments to architectural cruelty. The notorious Old Brewery building, originally a brewery, was converted into a massive tenement where, according to records, over 5,000 residents passed through annually, many sharing single airless rooms. Crucially, the district was built directly on the filled-in remnants of the Collect Pond, an erstwhile clean lake that the city polluted and then haphazardly buried. The perpetually unstable, marshy ground ensured that disease, typhus, cholera, and tuberculosis was not an exception, but a permanent resident of 5 Points. The air itself was thick with the scent of uncollected waste and desperation. The central anomaly of 5 Points was the collapse of societal norms. In 1890, the formal mechanisms of law and order simply ceased to function within these 5 streets. The police presence was minimal, often deployed only in large, heavily armed groups, primarily for riot control or raids, not daily patrols. The power vacuum was immediately filled by territorial street gangs. These were not romanticized figures of fiction. They were hyper-violent, organized cells controlling every inch of the economy, from petty theft to illegal liquor sales and extortion. The most feared names, the 40 Thieves, the Dead Rabbits, and the Roach Guards, didn't just fight each other. They fought for the right to brutalize the populace. The violence was casual and ritualistic. Gang members carried specialized weapons, savage metal knuckles, clubs lined with lead, and the iconic Kosh. The result was an astonishingly high murder rate that often went unreported or uninvestigated, as witnesses rarely lived long enough to testify. 5 Points operated under its own brutal, enforced code of silence and retribution. The rest of New York, particularly the elites residing uptown, viewed 5 Points with a mixture of moral disgust and convenient blindness. The prevailing consensus was that the residents themselves were inherently defective, lazy, immoral, and prone to vice, a perception that provided a powerful excuse for neglect. The reality, however, was that the systems designed to support these populations were either corrupt or non-existent. The political machine, Tammany Hall, saw 5 Points not as a human crisis, but as a vast, captive source of votes. They would provide superficial aid, a bucket of coal, a temporary job, in exchange for absolute political loyalty, perpetuating the cycle of dependence. This was the cringing paradox. The city needed the cheap labor provided by 5 Points, yet actively maintained the conditions of its degradation. It was the ultimate systemic failure, where the moral high ground of the city was constructed upon the literal swamp of the poor. The investigation into the pathology of 5 Points was spearheaded not by law enforcement, but by journalists and nascent social reformers, men like Jacob Riis. His method was revolutionary and disturbing, the use of flash photography to document the invisible truth of the tenements. Riis's work, published in How the Other Half Lives, acted as a forensic report on urban neglect. He didn't rely on anecdotes. He showed the unvarnished facts. The damp, overcrowded cellars, the communal lodging rooms where men paid pennies to sleep shoulder to shoulder, and the children surviving in makeshift shelters within alleys. Riis exposed the architectural mechanics of poverty by visually mapping the living conditions, the lack of light, ventilation, and sanitation. He proved that the high rates of disease and crime were not the result of moral failure, but of environmental constraint. He forced the city to look directly at the geometry of its failure. Riis's visual evidence provided the first undeniable revelation. The most significant killer in 5 Points was not the gangs, but the air. Specifically, the air quality inside the tenement blocks. Cholera and tuberculosis thrived in the dark, damp conditions. The lack of basic infrastructure meant that fresh water was scarce, and sewage disposal was often non-existent, pooling in the alleys and cellars. The average life expectancy in the area plummeted drastically compared to uptown Manhattan. For example, in 1890, infant mortality rates in 5 Points were often 4 times the city average. This data point alone indicated a complete breakdown of public health, acting like an open wound that constantly infected the rest of the city. The structures themselves were the pathology. The reformer community realized that policing or charity could only treat the symptoms. Radical demolition and reconstruction were necessary to address the root cause, the fatal geometry of the streets. The mechanics of reform, however, were brutally slow and met with ferocious resistance. Landlords, many of whom were wealthy and politically connected, profited immensely from the subdivided illegal housing. They argued vehemently against any mandatory building codes or demolitions, claiming government overreach. Yet, the evidence became too overwhelming to ignore. Key to the eventual change was the establishment of settlement houses, non-religious intervention centers designed to provide education, childcare, and basic medical aid. The resources the city failed to deliver. These centers, such as the famous 5 Points mission, served as temporary buffer zones against total collapse. They didn't solve the underlying poverty, but they provided critical, often life-saving relief by addressing immediate, solvable problems, teaching hygiene, securing daylight, and ensuring children had at least one clean meal a day. It was a tactical, localized fight against a systemic plague. The consequence of ignoring the crisis, as New York did for decades, was not merely localized suffering, but the permanent distortion of the entire metropolis. 5 Points exported its chaos. The criminality that festered there eventually fueled larger crime syndicates that reached into the docks, the finance sector, and the political machinery of Tammany Hall. Moreover, unchecked disease outbreaks didn't respect geographic boundaries. Periodic epidemics originating in the Points terrified the wealthier districts. For the inhabitants themselves, the ignored poverty created generations trapped in a cycle of destitution, violence, and zero opportunity. To be born in 5 Points in 1890 meant statistical inevitability, a short, difficult life marked by hunger, illness, and a high probability of institutionalization or early death. The neglect was a silent, long-term tax paid by the city's most vulnerable. The second, deeper mystery of 5 Points was the persistence of underground institutions. Despite the constant raids and the presence of missionaries, the core economic activities, primarily the illegal liquor sales and the gambling dens known as kips, continued to operate with brazen immunity. These illicit economies were not merely supplemental, They were the central stabilizing force for the gangs and the primary source of cash flow in a cash-poor environment. The most infamous structure was the Gates of Hell Tavern, a notorious sanctuary for hardened criminals. Its physical layout, complex, subterranean, with multiple escape routes, made it virtually impenetrable to police action. These hidden spaces represented the ultimate rejection of civic control, proving that even if the city tried to impose order above ground, the chaotic, self-governing code of the barbarians would survive, literally, in the basement. The tragedy of 5 Points connects to a larger, persistent cycle in urban history, the creation and eventual erasure of the impoverished district. From the London rookeries of the 18th century to modern-day informal settlements, the pattern is consistent. First, a desirable geographic location is degraded by poor planning and systemic neglect. Second, the population is blamed for the conditions created by the infrastructure. Third, once the area becomes a political or health liability, the city employs urban renewal strategies, often brutal demolition, to physically cleanse the problem, rarely addressing the underlying economic drivers that push people into similar areas elsewhere. 5 Points was eventually sanitized, but the forces that created it, unregulated capitalism, mass migration, and political corruption, merely relocated their destructive effects to neighborhoods like the Lower East Side and, eventually, Harlem. The lesson is not about one neighborhood's decay. It is about the repeatable, predictable nature of economic segregation and the official response to it. The physical legacy of 5 Points is almost entirely one of erasure. By the early 20th century, the city began a calculated campaign of demolition, replacing the crumbling tenements with modern civic structures, specifically courthouses and governmental buildings. The most symbolic act was the transformation of the central, notorious junction, the 5 Points, into what is now known as Columbus Park. Where gangs once fought for territorial control, children now play. Where the old brewery stood, the municipal court now operates. The original 5 streets were realigned and renamed, aggressively wiping the map clean of its shame. Yet, even today, if you dig beneath the concrete of these modern plazas, the historical record remains. Archaeologists working on subway expansions have unearthed the foundations of the notorious dens and the mass graves associated with the forgotten epidemics, proving that the brutal geometry of 5 Points may be buried, but its impact on American urban identity is permanent. 5 Points was more than just a slum. It was a perfect laboratory for urban pathology, a graphic illustration of what happens when rapid social change collides with institutional paralysis. The lesson is not historical nostalgia for crime, but a blueprint for future urban collapse. When density increases without corresponding infrastructure, when political machines prioritize votes over human life, and when wealth allows the privileged to simply look away, the result is predictable. A self-governing zone of anarchy, poverty, and disease. We look at 1890 New York and see the poverty of the past, but the mechanisms that built 5 Points, the architectural cruelty, the lack of clean air and water, the systematic neglect, are not extinct. They simply manifest in new zip codes, new countries, and new configurations. The geometry changes, but the failure remains the same. Understand the autopsy of 5 Points, and you understand the vulnerability of every city built on inequality.